About 3 years ago, I did something in regards to my drawing that I never, ever thought I would be able to do. And I did it for two main reasons. And I've got to say, the impact of this has far exceeded any expectations I had of both how well it could go and how easy it might be within myself to do it once I put my mind to it. What did I do? I threw away my eraser. I decided I was going to draw without the eraser. Not just without the eraser, but in fact without the pencil as well. I was going to draw directly in ink, freehand. And before anyone starts to complain, let me say there is nothing wrong with using an eraser. If you're familiar with the large detailed drawings on my Instagram account, they were all done using a pencil, using many erasers, using a 4x4 grid on the reference and on my paper to draw. I would ink over and add more detail to a pencil under drawing. Then I would erase the pencil and then I would add the marker, the sketch marker tone over the top. So I have no problem either with using an eraser or using a drawing style that includes a pencil outline which is erased at some point after ink is applied over the top. No problem at all. But I had two very sound reasons, I thought, for wanting to learn to draw without an eraser. The first reason was that I was wanting to work on my location sketching in preparation for an overseas trip, which in the end didn't happen, but where I was wanting to draw directly in ink and then put watercolor over the top of it. I didn't want to have pencil as well as the ink, and I didn't want to use an eraser at all because I had a little experience with some experimentation where the eraser changed the surface of the paper in a way that when the watercolor was applied, you could tell that something had happened in that part of the paper. Plus, I wanted the freedom to sit in the street and just draw as simply as possible. And I thought, well, the only way to be able to do that is to start to practice it, because the method of drawing I had wasn't going to let me do that. Although I was doing pencil drawings in the street, I was able to erase any part that wasn't quite working as I went. It's my second reason though, which is the one that I think might really be helpful for some people watching this. And at the time, it was the lesser of the two reasons, but this has become for me by far the greatest benefit I've had from learning to draw without pencil, without erasing. And that's that I hoped it would have some sort of positive impact on the creeping perfectionism that I found was happening more and more as I drew more and more. That as my, if you like, skill level rose, the need for things to be more and more exact, more and more precise, more and more correct, I could tell was becoming higher and higher. Maybe I could partly see things better in my reference, and therefore I was more demanding as to whether I'd achieve them or not in my drawing. I felt that sometimes though, I was using the eraser more than my pen or even more than a pencil. And I was getting more and more fussy, and so I was rubbing out lines that were almost on top of the line underneath and trying another line only very slightly different. It was taking a lot of time, it was making me very tense, and it was producing a very unhappy experience of drawing. And I'm going to talk about how throwing away the eraser really put the nail in the coffin for my perfectionism with my drawing. But I'll get to that after I deal with the first point, which was that I wanted to prepare myself in a technique and skills way to be able to draw directly for street sketching, location sketching on my next trip. And the first benefit, and this one's not so surprising, is that it increased my observational abilities. Now, I'd always thought this was a bit of a strength anyway, but I came to discover that because in the back of my head, I knew that I could always erase this line I've just drawn if it's not quite right, gave me a bit of wiggle room to think, oh yeah, I've seen that kind of enough. But once I got rid of the eraser and the pencil for that matter, and I'm just drawing in ink, I know that any mark I put on my paper will be there at the end. And I learned to find the information in my observation that I was going to need to be able to locate whatever marks I wanted to put on the paper accurately enough I also learnt how to use marks, dots, dashes, and visualization of on the paper, either from parts I've already drawn, then and/or dots or indicators around it, so that I could then visualize what I haven't drawn and have a, if you like, a backup check in my imagination, in my mind, that it's going to look right on the paper where I'm thinking it's going to go compared to the reference. I'm always going on about the importance of observation, and that so often our drawing issues, where what we've drawn doesn't look enough as the reference, comes down to not a lack of ability to draw, but that we simply haven't seen what we've needed to see enough to then hold it in our mind and translate how that's going to look on the paper. But not just was I forced to observe more, I was forced to develop this whole strategy of ways of marking the paper, of visualizing, of referencing and aligning more in my reference, and then using what I've already drawn more as a reference point for what I'm about to draw. And continually checking, and for continually checking across my whole drawing as it evolves, so that if part of it seems to be getting a little out of proportion, out of scale to the rest of the drawing, I can pull it back a bit with the next bit I draw, so it doesn't get larger and larger and larger, say, as it moves towards the right-hand side. I can't change what I've done, but I can modify what I'm going to do for the overall benefit of my scene, of my drawing. The next benefit I found getting rid of my eraser gave me was that it allowed a far more gestural, relaxed way of drawing to develop. One of the problems with a pencil under drawing is that when we then ink over, our focus can very much be on keeping on top of the pencil under drawing. And in some ways that means that what people see when the drawing's finished is really a tracing of an earlier version that's since been erased. And because the focus can be on the care with which we go over something, we've stopped seeing anything beyond just the next bit in front of where my pen is going to go, making sure it's aligned with the graphite and whichever direction the graphite turns. But that's not a good way to capture life and liveliness in our lines that's appropriate for where those lines and marks are in the object that we're creating from them, as well as then that object in the overall scene and where it's placed in terms of distance or centrality or periphery, what impact that has. When I'm drawing directly in ink, all of these things are in my mind as I draw the lines. And so my intention can be directly fed into my line work through my arm, through my hand, with speed, with slowness, with briskness, with perhaps a more intentional line, where we deliberately thin or thicken the line. All of these things we can do as we're actually drawing our scene, as we've observed carefully enough now and maybe made a few little positioning marks that won't be noticeable at the end. We can now put our marks on the paper far more confidently, and that means with whatever speed is appropriate, whether that's a lot or a little, to create the marks that in our mind we want to create, to bring what we're seeing into what we're imagining in our mind is the way we want it to look on the paper. And probably connected with that last point, or maybe in front of it really, was confidence developed. As I got used to not drawing with an eraser, I got used to not thinking in the same nervous way, is it right, is it wrong? Whatever mark I eventually put on the paper became part of my process, and dealing with it, whether it was exactly as I wanted it to be, where I wanted it to be or not, simply became part of my new process, because erasing that line was no longer an option. It was no longer a part of my process. So it kept my mind focused in the one place, the pen, the ink, the bringing to life on the paper what I have in my imagination from the reference. Whatever creative translation process I was going through to put on the paper. And confidence is enormously valuable when we draw. If we're tense, if we're nervous, then we're going to tighten our grip, we're going to slow down our marks. We're going to be focused probably on the end of the pen, and I'm not going to be relaxing enough to actually use my arm, to use as much of my body as I can when I draw. I'll probably end up focusing on my fingers, or maybe my hand, or maybe I'll be drawing from the wrist. And again, that will give me tight, less accurate, and certainly less interesting variety in my marks. And then another noticeable improvement in the drawing experience was simply the ease of equipment, particularly if I was in location. I simply had to have a pen in one hand, a free hand to hold my drawing paper or to balance it on my knees, and that was it. That's all I needed from start to finish, except perhaps a comfortable stool to sit on. But that made such a difference drawing, and even doing studio work was so much easier not to be reaching and to have that mind distraction of stopping, of thinking, oh, where's the eraser gone? It's been covered by something. Where is it? And eventually find it, look on the floor from when I dropped it last time. And I didn't realize how much I used to drop my erasers and they would bounce all across the room and under the bed and under the back to the wall or down the street if I were on location. Just how much easier it is not to waste all that time doing that. So it really was a perfect technique for location sketching. But having brought up perfect, that brings me back to the second main area of benefit that I think ended up being a real breakthrough event for me personally in my drawing and in the whole kind of mind journey that drawing is, as well as the art journey that it is. And can I ask, if you're finding this helpful, then please help me out and hit the like button right now. Now, don't get me wrong. When I talk about perfectionism, I'm not talking about a desire to do things well. I'm not talking about a desire to scrutinize what we've done and to refine it and to bring it as closely in line to what we've been trying to achieve as we possibly can, and to work really hard at doing that. Because I think that sort of mindset for an artist is a tremendous advantage in getting to the place they want to go. But I'm talking about that mindset being taken to the point where it starts to become debilitating, where the pressure that what I'm doing won't turn out becomes so great that initially it may just rob me of drawing pleasure, but it can reach the point where I don't actually want to draw at all because I'm too afraid it won't work out. And for some reason, that's a terrible thought, even though a part of me really wants to draw. I've had people tell me they're afraid to start drawing in case they make a mistake. I've had other people tell me they'll get halfway through a drawing, and if they haven't made a mistake by halfway through, the pressure of not making a mistake in the second half and ruining what they've just done is so great that they stop halfway through and can't finish a drawing. This is really what perfectionism looks like. And while I never didn't start to draw or stopped halfway through if it was working out, I certainly found that I was starting to delay sitting down to draw when I was basically ready to. And I realized it's because I was increasingly nervous of would I mess things up when I started or at some point. The pressure of so many video demonstration drawings as well probably didn't help that at the time. So how did this change when I threw away my eraser? Well, it helped me. It forced me, in fact, to drop my standards. Part of the reason I could keep pushing to perfection when I had been drawing with a pencil underdrawing or at least outline was that I could endlessly correct it and make it more perfect. And then my focus kept staying on, is it right? Is it right? Is it right? Instead of progressing my whole drawing, I was fixated on one line, on one mark that I'd made. Once I'd started, in the end, whatever marks I put there were there, and I had to draw through them if I couldn't draw with them. I had to use them in some way, or I had to use the marks that I was now going to make to mitigate whatever negative impact the mark I've just made has. But I learnt pretty early that it had to be really a huge mistake in one of the very first lines to not be worth pushing through, to not be worth persevering. That by the end, Whatever marks I'd put in the wrong place at the start, you really couldn't notice in 95% of the time or more. So I learnt, in fact, that these lines and marks that I had thought they had to be perfect was not such a problem if they weren't. I learnt, in fact, that the whole drawing process was more flexible and more creative than I'd given it for. It wasn't about making an excellent copy of my reference. And it's not that I'd ever thought it was that way, because I was, even at this point, trying to draw the effect of detail, not the exactness. But there was still some connection with the reference that I felt, as far as possible, I sort of had to make it perfect, even though no one who saw my drawing was ever going to see the reference. Well, except for all the people who watch my YouTube videos. But I really did come to learn that it's not any one mark, it's the totality, it's the whole thing, and that it's not over till it's over. And sometimes it's an adjustment I make with a few lines that just slightly shift an angle, or value I add, marker over the top that just darkens one area, maybe covers some marks that I didn't think were working very well. That in fact these things can really transform the drawing even at the last minute. That it's keeping everything in a state of flux and keeping my creativity engaged right till the end. That it's not like I'm trying to draw a little bit, I have to get that right, draw another little bit that has to keep looking right. It's how it looks at the end that matters. And a fixation on each part of the way and an agonizing over whether it's good enough is not helpful. This point really wasn't part of my process at this point, but one thing that I think is very helpful is if we stop seeing our drawings as artworks. Unless we're a professional artist, we live with the mindset of, I'm learning to draw. I'm learning to draw. I'm improving. I'm practicing. I'm critiquing my work. I'm looking at where it needs to change. But it's not that I think I'm Leonardo da Vinci right now. If I started learning the piano, I wouldn't expect all my pieces when I played them to be note perfect. And particularly if they were quite hard pieces. And I certainly wouldn't even start trying with a Beethoven concerto. I'd probably be choosing a tune that accompanies nursery rhymes. But I need to transfer that way of thinking to my drawing and take the pressure off me. Because I think part of the reason we're afraid of spoiling our drawing is because we see it as some sort of artwork that has to be valuable at the end. And when I first started doing freehand ink drawing, I had to learn to accept a lot of things that were a bit looser than perhaps how I might have liked them, weren't quite as tightly positioned as I thought they should be. But I found that, as in all things, intentional practice, focused practice, practice where we continually critique what we've done and use that in what we then go on to do, really was a fast track to rapidly improving a lot of the weaknesses I started with when I began freehand ink drawing. And over time, I found I could move confidently into more and more complex subjects and develop my own ways of keeping proportions as accurate as I could, and then of working the whole drawing at the same time as much as I can. It's not many, but it's maybe 1 in 20 drawings that I start for a video. I do a few lines and I think, oh no, that's not right. The scale's wrong. This angle's just too wrong, whatever. And I start again. And that's not a problem anymore. Whether I start again or push through doesn't matter. The thing is, it's a process to the end. And it's a process that I now bring much more confidence with my mark making. I think much greater vitality in the lines that I create. And I get hugely more satisfaction from the whole process. So if perfectionism, either full-blown or the creep of more and more and more, is something that you struggle with when you draw, I can really suggest saying to yourself, for the next 3 months, I am not going to use an eraser, I'm not going to use pencil, I'm just going to draw directly in ink, no ruler even, just directly in ink. I'll start with simple things. I'm not worried about how it looks at the end. I'm not going to have an exhibition of these drawings. This is how I learn and build confidence. Learn not just what sort of marks work, but what sort of movements we need to make with our hand, with our arm, with our shoulder to create those marks. An individual drawing may not turn out for some reason, But we may learn an awful lot about creating certain effects from parts that have worked out because we've pushed on and we've not lost the opportunity to learn something in that drawing session. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting, but I honestly can't say enough just how beneficial it's been for me to get rid of my eraser, to get rid of the feeling that I need to have a pencil outline before I draw. That's not to say I can't use that method occasionally. Sometimes it's a good method for the artwork I want to produce. But for my day-to-day sketching, and certainly for, if you like, practicing for location sketching, which I would like to do more of and do more in, it's great preparation, it's great training, but it's also good just for our mind games that we play when we draw. It forces us to be both forgiving of marks that aren't quite in the right place, but also to extend our creativity to being more than just copying our reference onto the paper, but to be seeing how we can develop the whole drawing to bring the best out of every mark that we've put on the paper, whether it's a good mark from our point of view or a not so good mark, to create a finished whole that works. So why don't you give it a go? It's not something you can probably just do for 1 or 2 drawings, although you don't have to do it exclusively. But if you'd like to give this a go, and if you haven't seen my 10-minute real-time videos where I do a real-time 10-minute drawing demo, and of course provide the reference on my community page if anyone wants to have a go drawing it themselves in 10 minutes as a really quick and easy and daily way to start to discover and to train and to build on the sort of skills you get and the benefits you get drawing freehand in pen. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, and whether you use an eraser or not, make sure you have fun. I certainly am. I'll see you next time. Bye.